You know what these books feel like? They feel like one longer YA novel that was cut into 3 smaller books and then minced into 1,000 tiny chapters. I mean, I know it was made with the trilogy structure in mind, but one can't help but question if this format best served this story. For example, by splitting a singular story into 3 books, you find yourselves having to end each book with one of the story's 3 biggest set pieces. In this case, the wolf hunt, the werewolf field trip, and the ultimate conclusion. However, that can and did result in weird pacing issues, like the sense that very little was actually learned and accomplished in the first book, or the second book's lull in the middle, when very little happened and poorly thought out scenes were needed to fill in the time. What's interesting is that the 150-ish page young adult book isn't nearly as prevalent as it was in the days of Goosebumps and Animorphs. If you fold the Werewolf Chronicles into one book, it would be about 400 pages, give or take, or the average length of a modern blockbuster young adult book like Twilight or The Hunger Games. Which makes me think that if it was one book and had a bit of stronger writing, the Werewolf Chronicles might have done better today than it did in 1996. But just how does this story end? Well, let's burrow into the Werewolf Chronicles Book 3, The Wearing. So it's a couple of days after the werewolf attack in the last book. Gruff has spent the remaining days of the full moon in private as to not alarm the Parker family, while Mr. Clausen and Mr. Grunter seem to have gone missing. This is addressed in a student gathering where we're introduced to the new principal, Mr. Smiley. The werewolves are getting smarter. They're using nice names as misdirection. Mr. Smiley assures the students that no mystical hanky-panky was going on that night, and chances are that Clausen and Grunter both drowned in the swamp. Stop panicking, kids. They weren't monsters. They just died horribly. And the kids are starting to buy it, to the point that the only people who still really accept that these were werewolves is Gruff, Paul, and the bully Rick. Rick had had close contact with a werewolf, and it seemed to have affected him a lot. His face was pale and drawn, and I noticed a streak of his hair had turned completely white. You know, in a world where social services wouldn't give a feral child a second look, the old being scared turned your hair white myth sounds just about plausible. Well, Gruff finally decides to get proactive and goes to the school library to see if he can find any information on werewolves. Yes, he's only been a part of human society for a month now, and he can already read. Finally, we're starting to play up the paranoia of the situation. Gruff has no idea who is and isn't a werewolf, and doesn't know if he can trust the school librarian in helping him find books on werewolves. Well, the clearest way is to check the name, and the librarian's name is... Mrs. Bookbinder. I love the fact that she married into that name. Yes, I was Miss Female Politician at first, but getting married sort of limited my career options. Gruff does find a book, an actual helpful book, that lays down the rules of the wearing that we already know because they're in the beginning of each of these 3 books. It explains that once a werewolf makes its first kill, it loses its essential humanity, aka turns genetically evil, I guess. Also, full-blown werewolves can transform at any time, though they have to transform with the full moon. It's a bit of fleshing out, but really it's nothing we readers couldn't have gathered for ourselves. Maybe if the books didn't detail the rules of the werewolves before starting the actual story, this might mean something to us. Of course, there's no clear answer as to how to fight the werewolf threat, and things are starting to get noticeably worse. People are starting to act strange, including Mr. Parker, who's been working nights at the local lab and coming home haggard and in a bad mood. Gruff and Paul decide to check the lab out, since, it's from Wolf Industries. So they sneak out into the middle of the night and run around the fence for a while before hearing some blood-curdling howling coming from the building, quickly followed by an entire pack of werewolves piling out. They soon sense Gruff and Paul and start chasing them, which leads everyone to a nearby pond with a dock and a really convenient boat. Gruff and Paul manage to get the boat out to the water, and this happens. The werewolf was half into the boat, grunting and snarling with the effort of trying to pull the boat back to the dock without overbalancing and falling into the water. I could see steam rising from its ankles, and black patches where the water had burnt its hide like acid. Yes, the werewolves are weak to water. Yes, I hope you didn't spend all those weak to water laughs on signs, because here you go. Yeah, I guess we weren't rolling in silver in 1996 like we were in 1941 or something. Okay. I get that this book was originally going to be about vampires, and while in the process decided to just keep the can't cross water rule for the werewolves. But it's kind of a large leap to go from can't cross water to water dissolves their flesh or something. On the list of vampire weaknesses, can't cross water, or usually more specifically, can't cross running water, is kind of a C-lister. It certainly did not mean that Dracula could be held back by the lawn sprinklers. It's also stupid that the werewolf book Gruff reads also refers to the weakness as can't cross water. Saying that a werewolf can't swim, and saying a werewolf will melt away like the Wicked Witch of the West or something, forces you into two completely different strategies. Well, these are our villains, people. Creatures whose evil plan could literally be rained out. Gruff and Paul wait in the boat till morning when the werewolves are forced to retreat, and they make their way back home. At school the next day, Rick is acting strange, and Gruff quickly concludes that he and a number of students in the school have been turned into werewolves. Gruff decides he needs to get into the lab tonight to find out once and for all what's really going on. So he manages to hide in the back of Mr. Parker's car as he heads for work, getting into the lab and spying on a meeting amongst a bunch of werewolves, including now confirmed werewolf Mr. Parker and the return of Ripper. We learn that the lab has been working on a formula that would make everyone catch werewolfism through, free Gatorade or something. However, the best anyone could do was a potion that allows incomplete werewolves to become full-blown werewolves without having to make a first kill, meaning there's a chance that Mr. Parker isn't actually full-blown yet and still has his morals about him. Morals like assisting a group of evil mythical creatures into taking over an entire town by poisoning the water supply or something. And no, Mr. Parker isn't doing this to protect his children. He makes a little lip service to that effect, but is immediately bitch-smacked by Ripper in a scene that suggests it had never been brought up before. Mr. Parker isn't some super qualified scientist who agreed to work with the werewolves as long as his loved ones were safe. No, Mr. Parker was turned into a werewolf, went, okie dokie, let's force transformation against people's will, cool, then went, wait, what about my kids? Got slapped over it, and never brought it up again. Mr. Parker is kind of a spineless shit. At least Ripper is upfront about how evil he is. So without the super juice, the werewolves move on to Plan B, which remains vague but will be carried out tomorrow night. Gruff manages to escape the lab, and the next morning heads straight back to the library in search of more werewolf info. Mrs. Bookbinder is there, and reveals herself to be one of the few remaining non-werewolf humans who know what's going on. She closed the drawer she had been rummaging in and put out a stock of papers on the table by the book. "These night creatures are very powerful," she said. "Very strong. There's only one way to beat them." My heart leaped. I knew I was right to come here. How? "You have to outthink them." "Oh. Thanks for that. That was really helpful." Actually, Mrs. Bookbinder pulled out a bunch of old newspaper clippings and starts going over the history of Fox Hollow. Over a decade ago, the town was actually called Pleasantville, because I think we've established that when people try to name things in this universe, their brains just freeze up. Paul and Kim got off lucky. They were this close to being called Minnie Parker and the letter Q 12 times. While Pleasantville was under construction, babies started to go missing, strange howling was being heard, and people started claiming that their loved ones were werewolves. Then, one day, the entire town was deserted, remaining a ghost town until Wolf Industries came in and swooped up the property. One story is brought to Gruff's attention, that of a woman claiming her husband was a werewolf. The woman then walked into the woods with her baby and disappeared, and, yep, you can see where this is going. But I doubt you know how far the rabbit hole goes. Mrs. Bookbinder cleared her throat. "There's more," she said, eyeing me worriedly. "Remember that woman who claimed her husband was a werewolf?" "Yes," I said, feeling an odd tickle of excitement. "She disappeared with her baby." Mrs. Bookbinder nodded. "That's right, into the swamp." She paused and gave me a sad smile. That little baby's name was Gruff. Okay, let's just unpackage all of this in reverse order, shall we? So Gruff's own human mother named him Gruff. Was she, what's the term? Stupid? I mean, there's being a werewolf and calling yourself Mr. Clausen. There's building a town and calling it Pleasantville. There actually are a few real-life Pleasantvilles, I know. And then there's naming your one and beloved child fucking Gruff. Horrible mom aside, there's no reason Gruff should associate that as his name. As established, he would have been too young to understand that that was his name. And what is actually gained by this? We could have put two and two together without having the baby also be named Gruff. Kids are not fucking stupid, and adopting an animal sound as a name makes enough sense in context of being raised by wolves. Did the wolves know his name? They supposedly keep making that noise to address him in the first book. Oh, and if Gruff is actually his legal name, then social services should have had virtually zero problem in identifying him and his parents. A kid named Gruff vanishes into the wood 12 years ago. A kid named Gruff comes out 12 years later. This is the easiest puzzle. So now we have the whole picture of the werewolf's methods. Doesn't mean we're any less confused. So the werewolves took over Pleasantville, and then what? What exactly are their goals outside of increasing their numbers? It's been a solid decade since the fall of Pleasantville. What were the werewolves doing during that time? Did they move to other cities? Doesn't seem like it, and you'd think they'd have an entire army by this point. But they had to have been doing something for them to have the resources to start their own company and restore the town of Fox Hollow. Mr. Clausen's nice custom car did not just spring out of nowhere. I guess the werewolves have been spending their time investing and playing the stock trade. Why do they need to focus on this one town? Wouldn't it be easier to spread out and infest the world like a disease? One werewolf becomes two, two becomes four, four becomes eight, and one flies to China and everything goes tits up. This is the most we're ever going to know about their plans, so that's disappointing. And then there's Mrs. Bookbinder. It's implied that she's here because she wants to stop the werewolves, and she plans to do that by putting the one helpful werewolf book in the school library and hoping some kid picks it up and figures things out. This is the entire extent of Mrs. Bookbinder's role here. Who is she? How does she know about the werewolves? Why does she think just being a normal librarian is going to help the situation? Why doesn't she go to authorities? Anything actually interesting about this character is left to our imagination. And sure, there are times when leaving things to the imagination can be a good thing. A character's motivation is not one of those things. And worst of all, none of this actually matters. Mrs. Bookbinder doesn't offer any advice beyond, you have to outthink them, which is about as useful as a hook hand to a gynecologist. There's no point in the Pleasantville story. It makes more sense for this being the werewolf's first go at this. And Gruff, learning that his human mother named him Gruff, doesn't add anything to his character. None of this plays into the finale. Gruff only uses stuff he learned from the original werewolf book. And that is its own can of worms. Who wrote it? Who published it? Is it a mass-produced book, or is it one of a kind? What exactly is the history of the werewolves? Oh, but never mind the interesting world-building questions. It's time to wrap things up. When Gruff goes home, he discovers that the entire town has gone to the recently opened recreation center. Wolf Industries is holding a surprise barbecue and parade and fireworks show, and literally every human being in Fox Hollow is there. Otherwise, this plan wouldn't work. Really, wouldn't this being a surprise mean less people show up? People make plans, they have homework and date nights and evening jobs. The movie theaters are still open. Some need to go shopping. Some are old and can't get around easily. Some have already made dinner. Some kids are grounded, and some people just don't like parties. The werewolves should be lucky if they get 5% of the town to come over. Gruff tries the normal routine of trying to warn the crowd with nobody listening to him. The sun sets, and the werewolves finally spring their trap and run into the crowd, starting to turn other people. It's the full moon again, so Gruff also transforms into Werewolf Level 1, which at least means he can throw a punch and defend himself, and focuses on keeping Paul and Kim safe, who finally realize that this creature is Gruff. The three of them manage to herd most of the people into the recreation center and into the swimming pool, because clearly a bunch of werewolves with a strong water weakness would build a swimming pool in their trap recreation center. This creates a choke point, and Gruff manages to use a fire hose, which makes a bit more sense. I imagine the werewolf stuff to keep the building to code to full inspectors, and keeps the werewolves at bay. Eventually, even though it doesn't seem to be killing them, the water drives the werewolves away into the forest. There's a series of howls suggesting that the last-minute wolf pack has returned and is driving the werewolves out for good. Because Werewolf Mr. Parker was knocked out in the process, so the kids drag him home, where Gruff gets the idea of filling a chest with all the silver in the house, which the Parker family just has way too much of, and then putting Mr. Parker in the chest. Really, just because it's the one rule of werewolves we haven't really touched on yet. Sure, it could kill Mr. Parker, but nothing lost, nothing gained, or something. Well, a few minutes in, the chest actually cures Mr. Parker of his werewolfism, and the kids start formulating a plan of how to get whatever straggling werewolves are out there into this box. But not Gruff. No, he's going to keep his werewolf powers because someone needs to be here to protect the town should the werewolves come back. The werewolves took his parents away from him and ruined his life, and now he's going to find justice. Gruff is Batman. And that's that. The third book certainly has the most things happening in it. We learn most of the plot here, the amount of action is almost tripled, and the pacing is kept up fairly nicely for once. That comes at the price that half of the things we learn in this book don't really mean anything in the big picture, and almost all of it is stupid in some way. As a whole, I wouldn't go so far as to say that the Werewolf Chronicles is awful and bad and, angry video game nerd it. And I'm not just saying that because the author was nice enough to shoot me an email. No, the word I'd use for it is lame. The Werewolf Chronicles is lame. It doesn't just not live up to its own potential, it forgoes potential altogether. None of its ideas are thought out, and there's no way to glean satisfaction from reading it. It's just really lame. It could have gone two ways, either as a bit of pulpy, trashy, preteen fun like a lot of Goosebumps books, or could have actually provided intelligent and engaging writing like Animorphs. But instead, the Werewolf Chronicles opts to be uninspired and tedious and lame. Sorry.